Hi, my name is Sarah Pearman. I am going to talk to you today about our paper entitled User-Friendly Yet Rarely Read, a case study on the redesign of an online HIPAA authorization. And I would like to thank my co-authors Ellie Young and Lorrie Cranor for all of their help with this project. So a major US health insurance company that for this talk we're just going to call HealthCo is building a chatbot for customers to ask questions about their health insurance coverage. That chatbot uses Google Cloud APIs for storage and natural language processing. So because of HIPAA, long story short, sending any of that data to Google Cloud requires special consent from the user or the patient. So let me set the stage of when someone might use this. Our imaginary user named Danny, let's say she hurts her ankle hiking. Maybe she needs an x-ray and she's worried about how much it's going to cost. So she goes to the HealthCo website. While she's there, she sees the chatbot icon and she figures she can ask the chatbot about her coverage. The chatbot then presents her with a HIPAA authorization document that she has to read and agree to before she can ask that question. So reading these documents, as we already know, is hard and it's time consuming. But users are told to make these choices about health data carefully. But we know that regularly reading documents like this could add up to hundreds of hours per year, which is already not a reasonable burden for the average user. And then the healthcare context adds extra pressure. You're even less likely, presumably, to want to read something like this when you are in pain and trying to seek healthcare in a timely fashion. So we knew that this consent flow could pose some challenges. And so we conducted a 3-phase study to evaluate it and also iterate on the designs. So I will talk to you about our qualitative remote user study sessions first. So in the first phase of this study, we used user session insights to iterate on and improve the original design of the consent flow for this chatbot. We were mostly focused on usability and comprehension of certain important pieces of information here. And we also incorporated known best practices for notice and choice as we redesigned the consent flow prototype. So in our user study sessions, users were given a scenario like that ankle injury example that I gave you. And we asked them to show us what they would do if they wanted to ask the chatbot a question. And they used an interactive Adobe XD prototype to do that. We also then asked follow-up questions about usability impressions, as well as understandings of and feelings about what they agreed to. And we did 3 rounds of that with 6 participants each, iterating on the prototype each time based on what we observed. So let me just set the stage here a little bit about what this consent flow looked like. So before they actually got to the HIPAA authorization process, if it was the part we were really iterating on, there were 2 steps that were basically the same across all versions. So first, they are on the website as though they're a patient logged in. They click the chatbot icon in the lower right corner, and then a little prompt pops up that says, "Hi, I'm Sam," and they can click Let's Chat if they want to use the chatbot. So next I'll talk to you about the actual HIPAA authorization part that happened before they could use the chatbot and the different versions of that we were evaluating here. So the initial version had 3 screens, at least in the required flow. There were some optional detours that users could take in this one. So on the first screen, users would see this prompt from the chatbot about agreeing to a HIPAA authorization, and then they saw 2 buttons. One said view resources, and that took them to essentially a human readable summary of this legal document. That button was optional. And then the other button, view digital HIPAA authorization, was required and took them to the actual legal document that they were required to view. So right away here, we have a confusing choice. People did not know which of these buttons was required. They did not know what view resources meant. And so that was a challenge for users. If they did click that view digital HIPAA authorization button, they would then see this screen, the second screen in the initial version of the prototype. And this was the actual legal authorization. It opened as a PDF in a separate tab. So there were some problems with the document itself. It was long, it was confusing, but it also left out some important information. And we found that users were just not grasping that the data wasn't subject to HIPAA or that Google Cloud was receiving it. The next screen that users would see was this prompt from the chatbot, essentially to click I agree to that PDF that they had just seen. And the main problem here was just that users didn't always understand how to return to this tab. This screen with the PDF was confusing for especially less tech savvy users that were not really familiar with browser tabs, and they struggled to find that tab in the top left corner to get back to the chatbot tab. So in version 2, we tried to simplify a lot of things here to help users get through this flow. So we put everything in a modal window. The first screen of the second version here shows that human readable summary that was previously behind that view resources button. They see this in this modal window, they scroll to the bottom and they click I agree. We thought that would help, but we actually found that users were still just confused by the presence of this extra document. They didn't understand the difference between this and the actual HIPAA authorization, so that was a challenge. And here's the second screen of version 2. So this is that legal document. It's in that modal window instead of in a PDF in a separate tab. They scroll to the bottom, they click I agree. And so in this actual document, we made some readability improvements between versions 1 and 2. We made some content updates to add some things that the US Department of Health and Human Services recommends in their model privacy notice. But many users were still not understanding that the data wasn't subject to HIPAA or that Google Cloud was getting it. So we tried again with a third version. This version was really simple. There was one screen in the HIPAA authorization portion. They just saw the required legal document in the modal window, they scrolled to the bottom and they clicked I agree. So we had removed the additional step of viewing that summary document. We did keep the pieces of that seemed to be useful, some of the more simplified language to try to help people understand. We just rolled that into the legal document. And we also added some summary sentences at the top, highlighting that the data was not subject to HIPAA and that it was going to Google Cloud. So this version looked really good in these sessions in terms of usability. Users didn't need hints to get through it, but their comprehension was still not where we wanted it to be. So part of that was just, as you would expect, most people don't read these things. They say, it's just standard, it's boilerplate. The company's just trying to protect themselves from being sued for something. And interestingly, we also found that the word HIPAA alone seemed to be giving people a false sense of security. So that was really concerning. Many people just saw that word HIPAA. They thought HIPAA equals privacy. And so they concluded essentially the opposite of what was true, thinking that this document, because it says HIPAA, it's telling me that data can't be shared with third parties. So next we conducted a crowdsourced survey to try to get some quantitative data about what was going on here. In the second phase, we surveyed over 700 participants on Prolific to compare 3 versions of the consent flow, those 3 that you just saw. So users were given a task, essentially that ankle injury scenario. They were asked to try to ask the chatbot a question, and they saw one of the 3 prototypes in a randomized fashion. We then asked them some follow-up usability and understanding and attitude questions. And then what we did in the survey here was after asking those questions that intentionally eventually did prime people to think about privacy. Once they were primed, we asked them to go back and review the text carefully. And then we asked them the same questions again, and they could change their answers if they had learned something new when they reviewed the text more carefully. So our final version from the user sessions tested better in terms of usability, although all of the versions did okay in that regard. But gains in understanding were more limited, especially until people did that second read through of the document. So across various comprehension metrics, understanding was poor before text review and significantly improved after. So people really were just not understanding things like that Google Cloud would receive data until they read the text again. And so that was important. There wasn't really a significant difference in people's willingness to use the chatbot between versions of the prototype, but what we did see was that there was a significant decrease in willingness to use the chatbot after people were asked to reread the document. So they were learning something new, like they were learning that Google Cloud was getting their data, which they had not noticed before, and they were not happy about it, and they no longer wanted to use the thing they had previously agreed to use, and that is meaningful. So I won't be able to get into the additional crowdsourced survey that we conducted in phase 3 in great detail. Essentially, we were looking a little more closely there at the effect of the word HIPAA on people's understanding. We mostly had null results in this part. They are still interesting, and I invite you to read about them in the paper, but there's just one part in the time we have that I want to share. And that is that we found in that survey that most people were vastly overestimating the power of HIPAA to prevent disclosure. So for those not in the US or not familiar with HIPAA, HIPAA does set rules about the sharing of healthcare information, but HIPAA doesn't apply to everyone or every entity. It applies to healthcare providers, health insurance companies, and other adjacent entities that interact with healthcare. So over 60% of people believe that HIPAA prevented anyone or any company from sharing healthcare information. Not true. Over 60% believe that HIPAA says no person or company can share protected health information without the patient's permission. Also not true. And only about a quarter of people knew the right answers to these questions. So takeaways: obtaining truly informed consent is always difficult, but even more so in the context of HIPAA. Best practices for notice and choice were able to help improve usability and comprehension on reread, but people were still missing a lot of important points when they were in the context of a primary task, like they would be in the real world. And if people are not noticing information that would cause them to be unwilling to use the tool, that's a major problem for informed consent. So I hope that as a privacy technology community, we can create things to make this kind of decision easier for users. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be happy to take your questions.